The only reason that you believe that Jesus is the Messiah is because you're reading the Christian translation of the Old Testament. One of the reasons that you and I are here is to actually encourage Christians that, listen, don't be talked out of your faith because some YouTube apologist is saying you don't know Hebrew and therefore Jesus can't be the Messiah. And so the Gospels are helping us by virtue of pointing us to the Hebrew Bible to say, you want to know what it means? Let me tell you.
Yeah.
Here it is. I think that Christians have every great reason to believe that Yeshua is the promised Messiah. I really get excited about how right the New Testament is.
What is up, my friends? One of the biggest questions I get from Jews and Gentiles is, did the New Testament writers completely change the message of the Old Testament? To help answer that, I am joined today by my good friend, Dr. Seth Postell, author, professor, academic dean at One for Israel Bible College. Seth, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here, Jeff. Thanks so much.
I was going to read your entire bio, but we'd never get to this interview. So let's just jump into the first question. But the main focus of today's discussion is how the disciples of Jesus became so convinced that Jesus was the Messiah based on the Tanakh. So the first question I have for you, Seth, why were the apostles so convinced that Jesus was the Messiah?
I think that there's something actually relevant to this whole discussion because here we are both, Jewish guys growing up in New Jersey where Jesus was actually a bad word. We didn't come to this by birth. We weren't encouraged to believe in Jesus. But one of the most important conversations I ever had, kind of a life-changing conversation, was I was sharing the gospel with my uncle on his deathbed, and I grew up in a Reformed Jewish family. So what does that mean, Reformed Jewish families? I could read the Hebrew letters and the vowels, but I couldn't actually understand what I was reading. After I came to faith, I was super excited, like most Jewish guys. Wow, I just think maybe I'm the only Jewish guy. You get all excited. Wow, Jesus, our Messiah, I can't believe it. And my uncle was on his deathbed, and so I went to share the gospel with him. I was probably very late teens, early 20s. And he said something to me that really hit me that's very relevant to everything we're going to do today. He said, Seth, the only reason that you believe that Jesus is the Messiah is because you're reading the Christian translation of the Old Testament. And if you knew Hebrew, and if you could read Hebrew, you would realize that Jesus is not the Messiah. And when I feel better, when I get better, I'm going to prove it to you. Now, we never had that conversation. That was our last conversation. But that was a really good conversation for me because what ended up happening is I started going back to the Jewish translations of the Hebrew Bible in English and realizing that there are big differences between how the Christians translate the Old Testament and how the Jewish translate. And so all these key verses that we assume are so clearly pointing to Jesus, and suddenly you look at the Jewish translation, you think, wait a minute, who's right? And so that conversation for me actually resulted in a lifelong pursuit of realizing, for me personally, if I'm going to have a conversation about my faith as a Jewish follower of Yeshua, I really needed to understand the Hebrew Bible. And I've spent, years now learning Hebrew, studying the Hebrew Bible, and so when we come to the question about, how did the New Testament authors come to see that Jesus is the Messiah, I think there's a couple of things. At first, they didn't quite understand his mission at first, right? It's clear that they didn't quite get what was going on until, in some sense, after the fact. It was looking at the actual events that they'd experienced and being in the presence of Jesus and seeing his miracles, not quite understanding the issue of his death and burial and resurrection, but then afterwards coming to the Jewish scriptures, coming to the Hebrew scriptures, and suddenly realizing that they probably got glimpses of what the Messiah was supposed to do, but they didn't quite understand. But what's really clear is that their whole mission after Jesus' resurrection is to convince both Jews and Gentiles that Jesus is in fact the promised Messiah. And one of the most important aspects of their defense of the faith is look at the Hebrew Bible.
Wow.
And so they implore us to be Bereans. And if you know in Acts chapter 17, when Paul ends up in Berea, and it talks about the noble-minded Jews in the synagogue in Berea, that they listened to what Paul said, and then they searched the scriptures to see if what he said was true. And so I think that the New Testament demands for us not just to hear what the apostles are saying, but to actually check and see if what they're saying is really true. In other words, it doesn't, nowhere in the New Testament do the apostles say, well, just believe me, you know, and everything's good. It's search and see.
Yeah, well, I want to encourage Christians that might be watching this, because some might be afraid that because they don't know Hebrew, they're not really understanding what's written. And you can watch all kinds of different videos saying that because you don't understand Hebrew, you're getting it all wrong.
Yeah.
Therefore, your faith is wrong, and people are doubting right now. So what would you say about that?
Not everybody is called to learn biblical Hebrew. I get that. That's not the calling of everybody, but here's the good news, that within the church, there are people that have that calling. And that's my calling. That's something that I've dedicated my life to. And I'm here because I want to encourage your viewers that they found the truth, right?
That's beautiful.
That the longer I've spent studying the Hebrew Bible, the longer I've spent learning the intricacies of the literary beauty of the Hebrew Bible, learning how the Hebrew Bible cites itself, that there is within the Hebrew Bible a dialogue. And once you start to gain the tools to see this dialogue, you realize, wow, the New Testament authors aren't necessarily saying anything new. They've actually entered into a conversation that had been going on for thousands of years with the prophets. And so I would argue that one of the reasons that you and I are here is to actually encourage Christians that, listen, don't be talked out of your faith because some YouTube apologist is saying you don't know Hebrew and therefore Jesus can't be the Messiah.
Well, obviously, the prophets knew Hebrew. The ancient rabbis knew Hebrew, and that would never take them into a place where they all agreed on interpretation.
Right.
So a knowing of Hebrew doesn't equate to correct biblical interpretation as well.
That's true, but it does limit your options.
Yeah.
Right? And so, you know, there are interpretations that are just simply not possible because the Hebrew doesn't allow. And again, as Jewish followers of Jesus, we are in a loving dialogue with our people.
Right.
And our loving dialogue is, do the Hebrew scriptures point to Yeshua or don't they? Or is Yeshua the Messiah of whom Moses, the prophets, and the writings spoke about? And that's the dialogue, and it forces us to go back to the Hebrew text. It forces us to go back to the scriptures, and obviously we can't just simply say, well, take Matthew's word for it.
Right.
Because they're going to say, but I don't accept Matthew. I don't believe in his authority. And so we can't just use Matthew to prove an argument from the Old Testament.
Right.
And that's where this discussion is so important, is by carefully reading the Hebrew Bible, can we defend the New Testament faith? I think that Christians have every great reason to believe that Yeshua is the promised Messiah. But sometimes we're right, but we don't know how right we really are. And I think that here's where we are saying, you know what, you're righter than you even realize.
You can have confidence in your faith.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think most Christians would immediately say, when you say, well, how do you know Jesus is the Messiah? Well, he fulfilled prophecy. And that's obviously true, yes. But do you think that there's another layer that a lot of us have never really thought about in terms of seeing the Bible as prophetic, in terms of looking at specific prophecies?
Yeah, so the classic approach to messianic prophecy is you have a verse in the Old Testament and you connect it to the New Testament. In other words, verse fulfillment, verse fulfillment, verse fulfillment. And while I don't doubt that there's a connection between verse and fulfillment, my own path has led me to understanding the beauties of the Hebrew Bible as literature and starting to seek how verses fit into larger contexts. Because one of the things that we have to do as Jewish followers of Jesus is to defend our faith against the arguments against our faith from the Hebrew Bible. And so Genesis 3:15 is not about the Messiah, it's about people and snakes. Isaiah 53 is not about the Messiah, it's about the people of Israel, right? And so the classic verse fulfillment is great as long as you're not challenged with arguments against understanding that specific verse as messianic. And this is where I think my studies have brought me to a place where I really get excited about how right the New Testament is. That the more careful we look at passages within their literary context, and the more we see how oftentimes the Hebrew Bible actually points us to other passages in the Hebrew Bible, that we start to see that there's continuity between the Old Testament and New Testament. So classic case in point, I mean, Highway 53, right? Most believers will say Isaiah 53 is messianic, and I say, ding, amen. But most believers may not know all the arguments as to why the messianic interpretation of Isaiah 53 is the most convincing. And the moment you start to place Isaiah 53 in the context of a new Exodus, so Isaiah is looking at the first Exodus and describing a future Exodus, and it's when you put Isaiah 53 in the context of a new Exodus, and when you notice that Isaiah is actually citing earlier scripture,
Right.
that suddenly you say that the light bulb goes off and you say, the servant of the Lord is a new Moses. In other words, the messianic interpretation is absolutely the most convincing interpretation contextually. And the New Testament, when it says this is the Messiah, they're absolutely right. One of the things my doctoral mentor always used to talk about was so helpful, like we'll never understand the New Testament's use of the Old Testament until we start to see the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament. And
right.
so when we talk about patterns, what we're actually talking about, we're talking about within the Hebrew Bible, that the Hebrew Bible interprets itself, that the prophets were reading the prophets were studying Moses. Those that were writing the Psalms, they were studying Moses. Daniel was studying Jeremiah. This extra added level of meaning, or an untapped, relatively untapped world for a lot of believers, is they're familiar with the New Testament's use of the Old Testament.
Right.
They're not familiar with the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament, and how profoundly important it is apologetically for defending our faith. So for instance, it's one thing to say that John in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, interprets Genesis 3:15 messianically. But it's a whole nother level if I can actually show you within the Hebrew Bible interpretations that look at Genesis 3:15 messianically.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about with patterns and interbiblical interpretation.
And it's important to be able to see that pattern, because I remember the first time I read the Old Testament, first time, and this was after I came to faith. I came to faith through a miracle. But when I actually opened Scripture, all of a sudden it made sense. And I'm reading through the Tanakh, the Hebrew Scriptures, and I'm like, wait a second, didn't I just read that story? Oh, it's a new story. And then I go, and wait, didn't I just read that story? Oh, it's a new story.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it just started, that's kind of shot out to me right away.
Yeah.
These repeating stories that are meant to show you that God is working through the people, and that He's also reminding you. We're a people group that loves to remember.
Yes.
And so when I read through the Old Testament, I was like, wow, okay, it's trying to tell me something here. Sometimes when I speak to our fellow Jewish Orthodox Jews on the streets, they'll say that the Tanakh is a law book. And I even read somewhere that I'm not sure who was it, Rashi, that said that it should have started in Exodus 12. Yeah, Exodus 12.
Correct. The Torah should have begun with Exodus 12.
Right.
Because it's the first law. And so he's actually quoting a rabbi before him.
That's right.
But then he actually goes on to explain, but the reason that the Torah starts with Genesis is to explain to the Canaanites that, when the Israelites came to possess the land, that God created everything, and He created the world, and He created the land, and He can give it to whomever He wants. And so it was the backstory. But
Right.
that's right. But there's a tendency to think about the Torah as a law book. That's all it is. And by the way, this is also not just the thinking of many, of Jewish people, but many Christians tend to think about the Torah as just a law book. That's it. That's all it is.
Right.
And so, we don't read the Torah now. We're New Testament Christians. Whereas Jesus said, if you believed Moses, you'd believe me,
Right.
right? Because Moses testified about me.
You were talking about Matthew a little bit earlier. Why does he have Jesus, or why is it so important for him to mention that Jesus is coming out of Egypt, passing through water,
Yeah.
going through the wilderness, and then going up on a mountain to teach?
It's really important to understand that the way that the Hebrew Bible works, and Hebrew history in particular, is through comparison. So we have an expression in Hebrew, Ma'aseh avot siman labanim, the deeds of the fathers are a sign for the sons. In other words, when you study the past, it's not just to give us a sense of what happened, but what will happen, right? That's how God works. Comparison is at the heart of biblical literature. This is like that. This is like that. And so what's really interesting is in Deuteronomy 18, Moses actually says that God's going to raise up a prophet like me. Now, Deuteronomy 18 started a huge, it was like the Big Bang in the Hebrew Bible, because the prophets are constantly being compared to Moses. So for instance, Joshua, if you look at Joshua in the chapter 1, God already tells Joshua, like I was with Moses, I will be with you. And sure enough, he sends spies into the promised land like Moses. He opens a body of water like Moses. He stands in front of this divine being, and the divine being says, remove your sandals from your feet because you're standing on holy ground.
Right.
Joshua's last speech in Joshua chapter 22, 23, 24, it's almost verbatim. Many overlap with Moses' last speech that in Deuteronomy, where he actually prophesies the future apostasy of Israel.
Right.
And so if you start to look through Elijah's like Moses, Elisha's like Moses. If you look at the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 40 through 55. And so I say all this as background to say that messianic expectation was driven by a longing for a coming of a prophet who would be like Moses.
Yeah.
The fact that Jesus is being compared to Moses, the fact that in chapter 2 he's born like Moses, and you've got Herod is like Pharaoh trying to kill the babies, and Jesus flees to Egypt, and he flees out of Egypt and through the waters of his baptism in chapter 3, and he goes into the wilderness in chapter 4 to be tested, and then he goes up a mountain in chapter 5, and and so if you look at the life of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew isn't doing something unexpected. He's not, for a Jewish reader, he's not introducing a new religious idea.
Right.
He's just simply saying, hey guys, look at the Hebrew Bible. Do you remember that Moses promised that he would raise up a redeemer like himself? Do you remember all the people that in some ways were like Moses in the Hebrew Bible? Do you remember Isaiah chapter 11, where Isaiah himself prophesies that the Messiah would be a new Moses? Do you remember Isaiah 40 through 55, when the servant of the Lord would bring a new redemption just like Moses? Well, guess what, guys? Here he is.
Wow. Well, I want to say about that there are similarities between Moses and other prophets, or prophets and Moses. Some of the things that Moses went through, they went through, or some of the things that he did, they did. But Moses in and of himself is a category. You can look at the other prophets and say, okay, they've done things like Moses, they've had experience like, they were not another Moses. And when you look at Jesus, you see him fulfilling this category, and then some.
Well, that's a really good point. So talking about category, so, Moses is a redeemer. He's a prophet. He's also a lawgiver. He's a covenant maker. He's a priest-like figure. He's an intercessor, right? We've described Jesus, and what's remarkable too is that when Jesus in Matthew chapter 26 is making the new covenant, okay? When he says, this is the blood of the covenant, right? That's actually almost a word-for-word citation of what Moses said in Exodus chapter 24 with the making of the Sinai covenant. And so Jesus is a covenant maker. And so when you talk about this category, it's very, very, very clear that Jesus is that category. Moses is very much like a king, but let's not forget two things. Number one, Moses, as great as he was, he actually realized that the Sinai covenant wouldn't solve Israel's problems. In fact, he prophesied in chapter 30 that Israel would go into exile, but that God in his grace would regather us and circumcise our hearts. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6. Now, without going into it, it would take a long time, but the prophets, the later prophets, actually look at Deuteronomy 30, and based on shared language, similar wording, themes, and motifs, it's clear that the later prophets understood that Deuteronomy 30 was not a renewal of the Sinai covenant. It was the new covenant. And so if you know that Israel's going into exile, right, and there's going to be a new redemption, then there needs to be a new Moses. And what's really remarkable too, that means that you also need a new Moses to make a new covenant. And so when Yeshua is with his disciples in Matthew chapter 26, he's actually speaking just like the new Moses. But obviously, and here's what's really critical too, is that Moses, in some ways, he was great. He was in terms of all the Old Testament prophets, there was nobody like him, but he did not bring Israel into their rest. He didn't. And so there's this expectation that if there's going to be a future redemption, the Redeemer's got to be greater. And so here, what's really remarkable is that we see Yeshua not just as like Moses. Yeshua is greater than Moses. And that's really important.
Yeah, it touches on the new covenant too when you brought that up, when Jesus lifted the cup and said, "This covenant is the new covenant in my blood." So a lot of times I'm asked by religious Jews, well, you don't wear tzitzit, the tassels. You don't, observe the law. And my response usually is, well, we can't. You can do things that are reminiscent of the law of Moses, but it's a broken covenant. And, we have a new covenant. And that new covenant didn't come from Christians. That new covenant came straight out of the mouth of the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah. That is something that would be promised to the house of Israel and the house of Judah that would be offered to the rest of the world. So Matthew isn't just recording history here. He's actually telling a story in a way that he expects the readers to recognize.
He's not recording history, he's interpreting it. He's telling us not just what happened, but what it means. And that's what the Bible does. It doesn't just tell us, hey, this happened. It tells us what it means. And every event that happens around us, right, just because an event happens, doesn't mean that we understand what it means. That's why you'll have different newspapers that have very different political perspectives that will look at the same event and say, this is X, and the other one says, no, this is Y. Right? And that's why even in the Gospels, it says that Jesus, when he cast out demons, some said, hey, you're doing this by the power of Satan. And others are saying, no, this is the finger of God. And so, and it's interesting, the Talmud doesn't even deny the fact that Jesus did these miracles, right? So there's no arguing about among Jews whether or not Jesus did miracles. The issue is by what power, and what they mean. And so the Gospels are helping us by virtue of pointing us to the Hebrew Bible to say, you want to know what it means? Let me tell you. Here it is.
Yeah. Well, let me push back for a minute, because a lot of people will just say that, well, Christians or you guys are just reading Jesus into everything. I mean, and I think people can get carried away. They might look at just the smallest passage and go, see, there's Jesus. But what's the danger in that?
So the bottom line, at least as I understand biblical interpretation, our goal in reading the Bible is to understand the author's intent, right? What did Isaiah mean when he said that, right? So, we're going back and forth, and sometimes I don't understand your questions or you don't understand my responses, and so you kind of follow, well, what did you mean by that? What I wouldn't like to see happen is that you re-edit this video, and suddenly I find myself saying things that I didn't say, right? You've kind of rearranged and you've put words in my mouth, okay? Nobody likes that. And so I would argue that the goal of understanding the Bible is what did the authors mean? And so now with the relationship of the Old Testament and the New Testament, I think as those who actually have the big picture, we all too easily want to, I think all of us are guilty of it. We want to kind of read our faith and find our faith in places where it may or may not be. And I would argue that a far healthier approach to the relationship between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is the Berean model. And again, the Berean model is really, really important. And that is, they listen to what Paul said, and then they check to see if what Paul said was true. In other words, you know, you and I are already at a place where I don't doubt Paul. I don't have any doubts about the New Testament. We're past that. We've suffered plenty. We've paid a cost for our faith. We continue to pay a cost for our faith.
Right.
There's a price to be paid. Jesus changed our lives. We discovered a new life. I don't question anymore. That said, I don't want to start finding Jesus in bushes and in trees, because in a sense it undermines our witness to our own people.
Yeah.
Right? It makes it look like our faith is ridiculous. It makes it look like that the only way we're going to find Jesus in the Old Testament is through allegory. Right? And that's not what we're arguing, that a careful reading of the Old Testament on its own terms gives us sufficient reason to connect the text with the individual that the New Testament describes. My whole approach to biblical studies is to let the author tell us what he means. And to the extent that I submit myself to authorial intent, to that extent in my own personal journey, I've fallen more in love with Jesus and more in love with the New Testament, and my respect for the New Testament's treatment of the Old Testament continues to grow.
So here's where I think some Jewish people might get uncomfortable. When Christians say Jesus succeeded where the people of Israel failed, it can almost sound like we're saying, well, Israel failed, Jesus replaced Israel, and now there's no point in trying to obey God's commandments. Jesus did it all for us, and that's not what the New Testament actually teaches. So what does it actually mean when you say Jesus succeeds where Israel failed?
Yeah, so listen, think about, to me, one of the classic examples would be the story of King David defeating Goliath. When David, the king, who's the Lord's anointed, he was chosen as, in the Hebrew, the word is Mashiach. And so when all of our people were hiding in their bunkers, scared to death of Goliath, this little red-headed guy goes out and he defeated the giant in the power of the Lord as the Lord's anointed. And what's interesting is that afterwards, the people of Israel that one moment were cowering behind rocks suddenly get this new sense of victory, and they join in the victory of King David. And so, you think about the high priest. The high priest was supposed to, be right before God, but our destiny, our fate, our atonement was entirely in his hands, right? The Day of Atonement is not, a pilgrimage feast. We didn't go up to Jerusalem to do anything. In fact, we're forbidden to do anything because somebody does something for us. Right? And when we fast on the Day of Atonement, it was to receive by faith the work of somebody else. He did it for us. And so this whole notion of having a champion or having a hero is nothing new. It's not new in the New Testament, that is. And so, obviously there are Christians, sadly, that would argue that, Jesus is the new Israel that's replaced old Israel, and now anybody that believes in Jesus is the new Israel. And I disagree with this on many, many levels. I disagree with it both in terms of how I understand the New Testament and also how I understand the Old Testament. And so I don't think the thought of Jesus succeeding where we failed ought to scare us. In fact...
Or be problematic.
Well, think about this. One of the key roles of Moses in the Torah is to be a mediator, because we constantly failed in the wilderness. And so Moses fell on his face, and he pleaded our cause, and he pleaded on the basis of God's grace for God to forgive us. And so to say that where Moses succeeded where we failed, that doesn't threaten us at all. In fact, we would say, praise God that we have Moses.
We have that.
And that's what we see with Jesus.
Yeah, having that intercessor, it's always been a Jewish concept.
Yes.
One of the biggest arguments today that I hear is that we don't need a mediator. We go straight to God. I will take my own sins upon myself. Nobody takes my sins for me. And I'm thinking, when has that ever not been the biblical story?
Imagine Moses coming to Egypt, and all the people saying, we don't need you.
Right.
We've got God.
Right.
Right? We don't need you. We've got God. It's, what's this believing in me? And it's interesting that in Exodus chapter 4, one of the big issues is believing in Moses, not just believing in God, right? In order for them to be brought out of Egypt, they had to actually believe in Moses.
In his sent one.
In Exodus chapter 4, verse 31, in Exodus 14:31, in Exodus 19, verse 9, one of the big issues in our relationship with God is not just that we believe in God, but in his servant Moses. And so the whole notion of believing in the ones whom God has sent, one of the reasons that the prophets rebuke us over and over and over again, one of the reasons that God, the wrath of God in the Hebrew Bible is that, he says, I sent the prophets over and over and over again, and you didn't believe them.
Right.
Right? And so, yes, we have a relationship with God, but it's a very mediated relationship with God.
It is.
We rely on those whom God sends to our people. We rely on mediators, and Jesus is that mediator.
Right. I've heard the argument, not only we don't need a mediator, but there's nothing that says you need to believe in so-and-so so that you can have your sins forgiven. And I think God never told Abraham, I'm making this covenant with you, and you need to say that you believe in the covenant, or else it's not going to happen. It's assumed that God gives a covenant, and we believe God. And that's what it says about Abraham, that he believed God.
Right. You can do a search of the word faith, actually the Hebrew word lehamin, okay? If you'd be amazed at all the places that it shows up, even in the storyline of the Torah, so much so that my doctoral mentor, again, John Selhammer, he argued that one of the key themes, one of the most important themes in the theology of the Torah is faith. And so you actually see how important faith is in the lives of our people. And again, faith is not just, and I know this sounds weird to Jewish ears until you actually see it in front of you in the Torah and in the rest of the scriptures. To be right with God means to believe in God and to believe in those whom he sent.
Yep.
And if you don't believe in Moses, you can't be right with God. It's not enough to say, I have God, I don't need Moses. That's unthinkable. And that's exactly why we as Jewish people are bringing the gospel message to the Jewish people. Because we're not saying here, accept a new religion. We're saying, here's the prophet like Moses. Moses himself said, to accept him, to listen to him, that God's going to put his words in the mouth of this new prophet.
That we should listen to him.
That listening to him in obedience and faith in him is consequential to our relationship with God.
If you believed Moses, you would
believe me.
Believe me.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And by the way, again, you can look it up afterwards. Look at Exodus 4:31, look at Exodus 14:31, and look at Exodus 19, verse 9. In every single one of those verses, there's an emphasis on the importance and the need for our people to believe in Moses. If you do not believe in Moses, who prophesied the coming of the Messiah, who prophesied the coming of a prophet like himself, if you do not believe Moses, you won't believe Jesus.
Wow.
And the problem with our people today, when you go onto the streets, of Jerusalem, the problem is not that, they still believe in Moses and they don't believe in Jesus. If you ask Jesus, he would say the problem is they don't believe Moses. In other words, part of our calling to our people is to convince them to believe Moses, right? If you'll believe Moses, you'll believe Jesus.
Wow. I was in an interesting conversation not long ago in Jerusalem, and this Orthodox gentleman was an awesome guy. But he said, honestly, the Tanakh has been taken out of our study. We don't really study the Tanakh. We don't look for verses. We stick to our tradition. Because the rabbis figured it out a long time ago, and we trust in them. So what he's actually saying is, we're going to remove the word of God, trust in men, but we're believing in them. He still showed that pattern of the fact that we believe in who we believe God sent to deliver his heart for our people.
Right, and yet, one of the most, I'd say the core accusation in the Hebrew Bible against our people, and I say this with broken heart, is that we don't believe the prophets.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
but that comes up again and again in the prophetic literature. We don't believe the prophets. And so I'd say that the cure to our people, our greatest need today as a people, is that we return to the prophets. And think about your own story. What happened when you started reading the prophets? What did that do for you? I know for me, it was like, wow, why didn't I ever see this before? And
Yeah.
it was just like suddenly Yeshua was looking back at me saying, hey, Seth, I'm
Yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah. I remember the first time I read Isaiah 53. Because I hadn't read it before. I hadn't read the Old Testament yet. And as I was reading through, I get to this verse and I read through it and I was like, well, I already believe in him, but he's here in our Hebrew scriptures. And I ran to the gentleman who actually shared Jesus. Have you ever read this before? It's like, of course, it jumped out at me. And they kept jumping out at me.
Yeah.
And it helped give me more assurance of my faith. One of the biggest objections I hear all the time is that the New Testament takes the Old Testament out of context. It's an argument that actually goes both ways because and I hate when people use, well, you just need to know the truth, because we hear it from both sides. You don't have the truth. You don't have the truth.
Yeah.
You need the truth. And we understand prophecy. You don't understand prophecy. But this objection that the New Testament or the writers of the New Testament take the Old Testament out of context.
Yeah, I would say that that's probably been most of my academic career.
Okay.
Like there are two things that get me up in the morning in terms of my own personal scholarship, and that would be one is seeing how the Hebrew Bible points to the Messiah, and number two, understanding how the New Testament cites and uses and refers to the Hebrew Bible. And I think that this whole notion of the New Testament misappropriating, misinterpreting, butchering the Old Testament, I think people that make that claim, these are typically people, number one, that actually are not very carefully reading the Hebrew Bible in context. That's number one. Number two, they're actually people that actually neglect the ancient Jewish interpretations themselves.
Right, great point.
And so you have some of these, online people that are trying to convince, the nameless, right?
Yeah, yeah.
People that are, coming after Christians and saying that's a stupid interpretation, in Matthew, or that's such a stupid interpretation, and he butchered it here.
Yeah.
And yet, a rabbi, rabbis 1,500 years earlier
Completely agree with it.
totally agree
Right,
with it.
right.
And like even Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 52 verse 13, you have the ancient Aramaic translation of the passage that says, behold my servant the Messiah.
Targum Jonathan.
Yeah, will prosper. And so what, are we going to say they're stupid? Right? Are they stupid because they saw that Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah? Or maybe they just simply were not biased by some of the difficult history between the church and the synagogue,
Right.
and they were just simply reading it as it was. And so the more I've immersed myself in the Hebrew Bible, the more excited I get about the New Testament, the more convinced I am that that they're very sensitive readers of the Hebrew Bible.
That's why I have such a hard time getting out of the Old Testament. I don't know if you're like that too. It's like I'm reading the New Testament, and I'm finding the Old Testament there, and I go back to the Old Testament, I just stay there.
But it goes back and forth.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
My again, going back to my doctor mentor, John Selhammer, he said something really, really amazing. He said, if you think about the church in Acts, so we call the church in Acts the New Testament church, right? And he said, have you ever considered the fact that the New Testament church was the New Testament church before the New Testament? They didn't have a New Testament. What did they have? They had Moses, the prophets, and the writings.
Yeah.
And they weren't sitting there thinking, well, maybe we ought to wait to start our mission once we get a fuller revelation.
Yeah.
Maybe we ought to wait until the Gospel of John is written in Romans so that we'll have something to tell our people, because of course the Old Testament isn't messianic, right? And that's nonsense.
Right.
You look at what Paul says when he's defending his faith. He says, I'm not saying anything other than what Moses and the prophets said would take place.
Well, if all these patterns exist, why didn't more people recognize Jesus then? Even his own disciples, like you said in the beginning of this interview, seem to kind of miss or not fully understand what he was saying? Why didn't more people recognize him, you think?
It's interesting that in Deuteronomy 29, God actually says of the Jewish people there, he says, God hasn't given you eyes to see or ears to hear.
That's right.
You still don't understand. In other words, the very people that experienced the Exodus themselves, Moses concludes and says, you don't understand it. You didn't understand it. Even if you read through the Hebrew Bible, look at the prophets. They were always alone, right? If you're kind of looking for what the truth is in the Hebrew Bible, and you've got, if you were in the Old Testament times, you definitely didn't want to go with the majority.
Yeah.
Right? So it seems to me that the remnant were the ones that actually followed the truth. And let's face it, the truth is not pleasant.
Right, it's a hard road.
It's a hard road. And so, the New Testament, like one of the things that they were convinced about was that the Messiah was going to overthrow Rome. Okay? But they missed the fact that there were plenty of passages about a suffering Messiah. It wasn't very popular in who wants to believe in a suffering Messiah. The whole notion that the thought that the Messiah would come and our religious leaders would completely reject him, like that doesn't sound like a very appealing thing to talk about in the first century. And so it wasn't that the Hebrew Bible wasn't clear. I think that a lot of times what ends up happening is that we, based on our own prejudices, based on our own desires, based on the influences around us, it kind of forces us to read the Bible in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I find myself too often getting into ruts where why didn't I see this before? Okay? But once they saw it, and once we saw it,
right,
you don't unsee it.
All right, we've been talking about this for a while now, and this is the reason why you actually wrote a book about it.
Yes.
Okay, so we have this book here, The Art of Narrative Analogy by Dr. Seth Postell. What made you finally think I need to put all this down in writing?
Yeah, so, this book is it's like 20 years in the making.
It is.
It's 20 years in the making.
But I remember when you started writing it, it wasn't 20 years ago.
No, it
But
came
your
out
study.
fairly quickly, but the whole notion, I realized when you talked about this added layer that people don't always see, and that's the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And the fact of the matter is that the Hebrew Bible is filled with parallel stories. And when I say parallel stories, I'm not just simply talking about happenstantially parallel. In other words, what I'm arguing is that it's very common for one author to write his story intentionally comparing it to an earlier story, and he expects his readers to make the connection. So when Matthew writes his story about Jesus coming out of Egypt and through the waters, and he expects his readers to identify those parallels. In other words, Matthew's intentionally drawing an analogy to an earlier passage of Scripture so that we can understand the full impact of what's happening before us in his description. And so I found that not only does the New Testament make analogies to the Old Testament, but within the Hebrew Bible, there are constant analogies. The Old Testament constantly has analogies to the Old Testament. And the more I noticed them, the more clearly I started to see the ways in which the New Testament authors were interpreting passages messianically. And I realized that most Christians don't really think about these parallels. And so what I wanted to do is I wanted to write a textbook to believers that don't know Greek or don't know Hebrew, and to give them tools for them to actually notice for themselves when one passage parallels another passage, and the kinds of questions that need to be asked in order to interpret the parallels. And my goal in this book was to actually get people really excited about reading the Bible and to actually have insights into how the New Testament interprets the Old Testament in such a way that will strengthen their faith. And so that was the goal of the book. And one of the things I did is I used a lot of movies and analogies to movies. And why did I do that? Because, again, grew up in a Reformed Jewish family, which means we weren't reading the Bible growing up. What was I doing in 1977?
Watching Star Wars.
What every other kid did. I stood on a line wrapped around the movie theater for 3 hours, went in and saw Star Wars. And very quickly, in 1977, for this little Jewish boy from New Jersey, Star Wars became my canon.
Yeah.
And I watched all the Star Wars, and all my games with Star Wars. And so Fast forward 2015 when you have the new trilogy Star Wars, because I knew the first trilogy by heart, I noticed that the new trilogy was a very sophisticated copying of the first trilogy. And the moment you start to see the parallels, then you start to actually predict where the new movie is going. And so I used Star Wars and other movies to get people excited that don't necessarily get excited about reading the Bible.
Yeah.
I wanted to draw them in to say, hey, listen, you don't need a PhD to do this. You just need to learn to read.
Right.
And you need to read a lot. And you need to immerse yourself in the Moses movie. If you immerse yourself in the Moses movie, you will become a Jedi Knight, and you will start to see how the New Testament relates to the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, because you've gotten really excited about the earlier movies.
Wow, it's one of the reasons I have a hard time getting out of the New Testament, the Old Testament, because I'm going to be reading through it, and I like to call them speed bumps. There's so many speed bumps in there that make me go, I've seen that before.
And this is what's surprising to me, is that if you look at the way that Paul, writing to Gentiles many times, he cites so many Old Testament passages and assumes that that's their scriptures. In other words, because the Hebrew Bible, praise God, our people translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek.
Into Greek, yeah.
That was one of the greatest gifts to humanity.
Yeah.
So that when the gospel started to spread, the church had a Bible. The church had a Bible, and Paul and all the New Testament authors expected Christians, Gentiles and Jews alike, to know that Bible. And maybe an illustration of why it's so important to be reading the Hebrew Bible and to really immerse yourself in it. So my wife did not grow up with Star Wars, okay? She did not, okay? And so in 2015, we went to the new movie together. I'm with my kids who love Star Wars,
Yeah.
and my wife is looking at the new Star Wars, and she's enjoying the special effects. She's getting into the plot, but she's missing the backstory. She's not like, my jaw is dropping saying, hey, I've seen people putting a secret plan into a droid before. Hey, I've seen that droid go out into the wilderness and be discovered by somebody who doesn't know who their parents are.
Right.
Like, I've seen this before. And so my wife could appreciate the new Star Wars, but she did not really understand the depth of the plot and the intricacies of the new movie, because she didn't know the first Star Wars. And so I would argue that a believer that doesn't, can somebody get saved reading the New Testament? Well, it happens all the time. Is the simple message of the gospel clear in the New Testament? Of course it is. There's no question about it. But to understand the person and work of Yeshua, the Messiah, to understand his priesthood, to understand his sacrifice, to understand why he did and said certain things. Let me give you an example. Mark's account of the stilling of the storm in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. Okay, he goes into the boat. There's a sudden storm. The boat starts to fill up with water. He's asleep. The sailors come and wake him up. Don't you care that we're going to perish? Right? Does anybody that's been watching the Old Testament movie says, I know this story. This is Jonah. This is the story of Jonah. And you're watching, you say, and what's interesting is Mark doesn't just parallel the story of Jonah chapter 1 in terms of the plot, but he actually takes very unique phrases from the Greek version of the Septuagint and repeats them in Mark. In other words, Mark expects us to see the connection. But here we go. Without seeing the parallels to Jonah, you miss the point of Mark's story. What do I mean? In Jonah chapter 1, the sailors wake up Jonah and they say, get up and call on your God. When the disciples wake Jesus up, the assumption is they're going to wake him up and say, hey, get up and call on your God. But what does Jesus do? He takes the part of God in the story of Jonah. He says, you know what? I'm God. In other words, the stilling of the storm by Jesus, I'll never understand the full impact and the theological depth of who Jesus is without realizing that Jesus is doing something that only God does in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
Jesus is doing something that only God does in the story of Jonah, so that the story ends with a question without an answer. What's the question? Who then is this that even the storm and the sea and the waves obey him? Well, I have an answer because I've been reading Jonah. He's the Lord.
Well, you'll have a lot of questions answered by reading this book. So, Seth, what do you hope that people come away with after reading this book, The Art of Narrative Analogy?
My greatest desire, I feel like my life will be of some value if people love the Bible more because of even some kind of a small influence that I have. My journey to Jesus as a Jewish person, my journey to Jesus studying the Hebrew Bible, my journey to Jesus through wrestling through the relationship between the Old and the New Testament. This is kind of giving people steps that help them to get excited about that journey too. And so my hope for your viewers that already love the Bible, that after they read this book, that they're going to love the Bible even more, and that they'll actually have tools that maybe tools that they've never considered, that they haven't actually considered. Again, the whole paradigm of the Old Testament's use of the Old Testament. And
Right.
once they consider it, it's going to blow their minds.
Yeah.
They're going to see things they've never seen before right in front of their face.
Well, I love the Bible even more now, just sitting here talking with you, Seth. Like you're a great combination of like humor. We get along real well because we grew up in the '80s. You know what I mean? And we have these movies that late '70s, early '80s to watch. You talk about Star Wars in here. It's really fun. Yeah. The book starts out really, you hook us in right away, which is really amazing. So let's close with a final question, Seth. Yeah. If someone watching this has always been told the New Testament twists the Hebrew Bible, what would you say to them?
Please read, be a Berean, check and see. Again, I was there. That's actually one of the most important challenges I ever received. It was the life-changing challenge by my uncle. The New Testament authors twist, or the translation of the Old Testament has been twisted by Christians. I wouldn't be sitting here today were it not for that challenge, because that challenge sent me to be a Berean and to start studying for myself. And I just want to encourage your listeners, again, your viewers, get excited about the Bible. Be a Berean. And I'm convinced that if we'll hold the New Testament with one hand and search the Scriptures with the other, our faith and our confidence in our faith and our excitement about telling people about our faith will only grow.
I love that. I often tell people that I'm speaking with on the streets of Israel, don't believe me.
Yeah.
We got a whole, massive book of literature here, the Hebrew Bible that you can check for yourself. Don't believe me. Seth, I'm so grateful that you joined me here today at Highway 53. Where can people find this awesome book?
Yeah, so it's actually available on Amazon. They can look up or The Art of Narrative Analogy or my name, Seth Postell.
Yep.
And it can be ordered on Amazon. It's available, I think it's in Kindle, hard copy, and also I think in Logos software.
Yeah, this is great. I definitely recommend getting this book. Go get it, pick it up in whatever format you can find it. Read it. It's a lovely read. It is, because you're so academic, but this is so attainable for the average reader. So The Art of Narrative Analogy by Dr. Seth Postell. Go get it. One thing that I really was thinking about this whole time during this conversation was your podcast with Golan Broshi at One for Israel on the YouTube channel, One for Israel, The Case for Messiah.
Yeah. You
do this thing there.
Yes.
So read this book and also check out that podcast, The Case for Messiah, because they're I would call them bite-sized, because you're not getting a whole class, a semester at the Bible college, but you're getting a very well-studied, condensed version of a classroom study of these parallels, of these things, and how really the Old Testament points to Yeshua as Messiah. So check that out as well. Check out the One for Israel YouTube channel and the Case for Messiah podcast. So if you've ever doubted that the Old Testament points to Jesus, this book, the podcast, Seth's work, is for you. Definitely go check it out. I'll link all that stuff down in the description. Seth, thank you so much for joining me here today, man.
Thanks, Jeff.
It was good. I feel like I've grown. I'm so thrilled to go back now into the Old Testament and read that parallel between Jonah and Mark and the boat. You know, that it's amazing. And you always said, you said this to me a long time ago, if you read the Bible like a movie,
Yeah.
you'll understand it much better.
Yes.
Thanks,
Amen.
Seth Postell.
Thanks, Jeff.
Love you, man.